This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Anne of Green Gables, and Lucy Maud Montgomery will be talking about the writer's career and the Anne of Green Gables books and media franchise that has followed. The conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is Lucy Maud Montgomery and her Anne of Green Gables series of books and other stuff that has followed. I have three ladies who will be talking about that, and I'm going to give them a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. First, on the top of the screen is Holly Blackford. So Holly, if you could give a little background about who you are and things you've written about Anne of Green Gables, what it's meant to you, etc.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Holly Blackford. I'm a full professor at Rutgers University in Camden, although right now working at home. We are entirely remote, so I miss campus very much. I'm a children's literature specialist and actually an American women's writing specialist. So my work on Anna Green Gables has been in the context of her influence in children's literature. So I put together the centennial study of Anna Green Gables, but I've also done work on queer approaches to Anne. I argue that a lesbian novel was actually based on Anna Green Gables. And then more recently, I did an article about how Anne was also influenced by Topsy in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I do a lot of sort of intertextual work and influence.
Elsie Calland I interviewed a couple of months ago regarding a couple of her websites, most notably for our purposes, the Tea and Ink Society. So welcome back, Elsie. If you could give a little background about yourself, your websites, and your media marathon through Anne of Green Gables.
Well, I'm Elsie. I'm from Alabama. I grew up reading Anne of Green Gables and have been a fan since childhood of the books and of the Kevin Sullivan movies from the 80s. Now I run a blog that is literary focused. I mostly focus on classic literature, but do some modern stuff as well. And because Ella Montgomery is still one of my favorite authors, even as an adult, I sometimes write a blog post about her and her works. And I wanted to, with the more recent adaptations of Anne of Green Gables that have come out, I wanted to watch those and see if they held up to my memories of the book from childhood and then how I've experienced them now as an adult. So I watched those and then kind of got into it and watched every other Anne of Green Gables film that I could find. So found some interesting treasures from the vaults, so to speak.
We'll talk about them in a little bit. Monica Hilda is our third guest. And Monica, if you could give a little background about yourself and your relation and things you have written about Montgomery and Anne.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Yes, so Monica, I'm from Vancouver, Canada, and I teach English at Trinity Western University. I'm also a full prof now. My main area of research is actually not Montgomery. I'll just say that right now. It's C.S. Lewis, but Montgomery has always been a real favorite with me. In terms of what I'm perhaps more known for, C.S. Lewis and other Inklings-related authors. I'm a co-founder, co-director of the Inklings Institute of Canada. So in terms of Montgomery, I've just always loved reading Montgomery. And one day, it was actually literally, I was leaving Waco, Texas, and I was rereading In the Air, Anne of Green Gables, and it just really struck me the humor that Montgomery uses. And anyway, that led me to a few publications on Montgomery. Some of them have to do with gender, how she viewed that, or how I think she viewed it, and then also very much how she treated the Christian faith. So Montgomery is just a favorite. I just love reading her.
Well, I'll inevitably probably get around to doing some shows on C.S. Lewis and Willa Cather, which I see Holly is an expert on, so I know who I can call first for those future shows. So let's talk a little bit about who Lucy Maud Montgomery was and what may have led her to the Anne persona and how much of Lucy is in Anne, etc. So I don't know if Holly or Monica wants to take it first. can we talk a little bit about the background of Montgomery? Where was she born? What kind of background and how this led to it? I don't know, Holly, maybe if you want to take that first.
I'm not an expert on biography of Montgomery per se, although there is a lot of Lucy Maud in Anne. She had very similar experiences living with her very dour grandparents, and feeling, I think, a little bit trapped. And there are traces of her in the fact that she did not get to completely follow the career trajectory that she wanted to do and go to college. And such things. But the idea for Anne actually came from, she was a scrapbooker, and she had a snippet that she had cut out from a newspaper, a very brief line about a couple that applied to an asylum for a boy, and a girl was sent them by mistake. So this very brief sort of newspaper clipping, she filed it away, and in going through for literary ideas, started to flesh that out quite a bit. And originally she was writing Anne for a Sunday school periodical, and became so attached to the character that she created. She actually talks about it as Anne sort of taking over her consciousness and her artistic imagination. So she got so attached to the Anne she created, she didn't want to waste her on a Sunday school periodical. And I make a lot out of that in my introduction to the Centennial, because Anne takes over everybody. Anne takes over the entire community of Avonlea, and I think it's significant that that's the experience of the author as she started to create her. Anne became a kind of life-bringing psychological entity that just colonizes every place she goes and shifts all kinds of relationships. So I really think Anne made Montgomery as much as Montgomery made Anne.
Yeah, the character of Anne Shirley does seem to, both in the books and in adaptations that I've seen, she does seem to have that kind of positive effect. There was the famous book about how to win friends and influence people. She seems to have been like the original influencer.
Or how to take over people. I mean, I think it goes both ways. She makes people dizzy. She makes them sort of giddy. Her language just takes up, I mean, I look at Montgomery as a modernist, actually, and not just a Victorian writer of the Bildungsroman, but she was interested in psychology. She had read Henry James. So a lot of the sort of psychological realities and stream of consciousness writing, I think, took its shape in Anne as a child, which what makes her so amazing. What I love about the Anne books is how Anne like the moment she's in a room, she shifts relationships. Everybody's starting to rebel against everybody else. Everybody's changing. Marilla is laughing. Sometimes I don't know if this book is about Anne's development as much as Marilla's development, right? So she's a catalyst, a kind of springboard for all kinds of transformations.
Monica, if you want to pick up, what are your thoughts about?
Yeah, thank you for that, Holly. That's lovely. I was thinking too that, and I've written about that as well, that with Anne, Montgomery is really recreating, investigating, and creating the kind of happy childhood and young adulthood that she would have liked to have had herself. So the whole idea that the fact that Montgomery's mother died when Lucy Maud was about 21 months old, and she was raised by the very strict Scottish Presbyterian grandmother for a short time. Her father, having moved to the prairies, started a new family, and for a short time, Lucy Maud, as a 15-year-old, lived with them. But again, that wasn't the thing, because of the idea that she would be used as a sort of a babysitter and not, exploring her own world. So I think that coming back to the point of the happy sort of childhood, young adulthood that Montgomery envisions in the books, which she didn't have, I think there's something to remember here, that Montgomery was really very proud of her Scottish Presbyterian heritage. So she really, in many ways, honors that, but she also is very critical of it, because she really is a romantic, very influenced by sort of a child-centered approach. And, well, I'm sure there's more that we can say about that. But those are a couple of things to add to the things Holly has already said.
Elsie, do you have any comment about Montgomery and her life and how it may have affected her books?
No, not in particular.
Okay. So let me.
Can I put one thing
Yeah.
in here? I don't know if people have read her journals. Monica, have you read her journals?
Yes.
I haven't read all of them. I only really, looked at the period of composing Anne, and then a couple other entries here and there. But her life journals are so disjunctive with the, like you're saying, happy childhood. It really is jarring. It reminds you of sort of looking at the journals of Virginia Woolf or something. You have someone with clearly depression or at least a lot of emotional turmoil. And and so I would recommend, if people want to know more about Montgomery, they look at those journals, because it couldn't be more drastically different in coping mechanisms, and is clearly a fantasy way of coping with neglect and poverty and dreams that are not fulfilled.
You had mentioned viewing Montgomery as a modernist writer rather than, I guess you would call it Victorian. But that puts me into mind of the comparisons that have been made between Anne Shirley and some of Mark Twain's characters, most specifically Tom Sawyer. And most people, when they look at the Anne books especially, we'll talk about some of her other non-Anne books, they generally class it as children's, or maybe now it would be classified as young adult novels. Do you think that the Anne books specifically are more in line with Tom Sawyer, to use the Twain, or more like Huck Finn, adult literature? Whoever wants to go in, step in first.
I think it's a crossover novel, really. Yes, it is like Tom Sawyer. I mean, the character of Tom Sawyer is basically Anne in male form, the way he imports imagination into landscapes that really do not support imagination, right? And this kind of fidelity to romantic periods. But Huck Finn, the consciousness on display in Anne is very, very modernist. It's very informed by more 20th century psychology, psychology of trauma, psychology of childhood, which really didn't begin until the late 19th century. And Tom Sawyer's not a very psychological novel. Huck Finn is really where you get a new kind of understanding of child cognition, and the way sort of scraps of culture are put together in the child mind in really different ways. Anne is a walking scrapbook of cultural kind of fragments. So I've actually compared her to kind of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, in terms of she harbors all of these scraps of stories and imagination, and then makes it anew, and creates a kind of reality around that.
Monica, what would you say?
Yeah, I was going to ask Holly, do you think that Montgomery saw herself as one of the newer modernist writers? And I'm thinking about this. I certainly see what you're saying about her interest in psychology, more of the interiority, I think was the word you used in your intro chapter to that collection. But for myself, I mean, I'm thinking of Montgomery when she says she's comparing herself with the authors that then really became popular in the 1920s and all. And her idea, I could write about, there are pigsties and there are sunsets, but I prefer to write about sunsets.
Right.
And then the response to Montgomery is being, oh, this sentimental novelist, she's not really grappling with real life issues. And a lot of us are saying, well, she actually is, but she's doing it from this framework of hope, as opposed to, well, we don't know, or we're in despair.
Right, and that is often the case, is modernist writing for children take elements of modernism in a kind of different direction. They don't tackle it like James Joyce would, per se. And I'm thinking in the journal of the line where Ella Montgomery says, "I just read what Maisie knew, and I still don't know what Maisie knew." But because the character of Maisie is not for children, it's an adult, sort of its consciousness. Right. Yeah. So she's not going to go that far. I agree. I think she's a lot like Willa Cather. Willa Cather is, I think of as a modernist author, but not as experimental and as abstract as some of the more highbrow. But she also was accused of sentimentality and nostalgia. But if you look inside, these are kind of political about how certain women novelists aren't included in the modernist canon when clearly they're working in the same sort of stream. And you're right, they're working on sunrises, sunsets, but there's no reason to not line them up with modernists and kind of sort that out, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and I'd be happy to talk a bit about the Blue Castle, which is not for, not a children's novel, and of course the short stories, which are not children's literature genre, but that's something we could get to maybe a bit later.
Yeah, we can
discussion.
talk about that when we get to her non-Anne works. Elsie, I know that you're sort of the expert on the extra media stuff, but let me just ask you first, do you have any comments regarding Anne as a child in the literature and or in the media adaptations?
The way Anne's portrayed in the media adaptations versus how she is in the book, whether it
Yeah,
matches.
yes, sure.
I think of some of them it does. Monica, I think you were mentioning how Montgomery is kind of taking a position of hope in her books.
Yeah.
Almost in like almost creating this fantasy world, something like a happy alternative. So I think some of the movie adaptations have probably consciously chosen to frame their story that way, and some have consciously chosen not to, just to explore a different side of things. So personally, I prefer the adaptations that go with the framework of hope, because I think it's a bit more accurate to how Montgomery chose to tell those stories.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a film made in the 1940s. There was a famous film by Val Lewton called The Cat People, and it had a sequel called The Curse of the Cat People, which is about a young girl whose mother has died, and the supposed cat people person is her mother, and there's a stepmother that comes involved, and it's really interesting because it's one of the I think greatest movies that shows the perception of a child's view of the world. And while the first movie, Cat People, was supposedly supernatural, this is actually puts doubt on the first movie whether this was actually real or not in a supernatural sense. And when I first saw, for example, the adaptation with Megan Follows in the Kevin Sullivan films, that first 40 or 50 minutes where she's coming to visit the Colleen Dewhurst, Marilla, and what was it, the Farnsworth version of Matthew, you get a few moments where you get some of that same vibes that I got in that Cat People movie. So I don't know if you've seen that, but let me just ask you specifically about that. And then there was also the original one with the actress who took Anne Shirley. That actress was a bit older, I think, than Megan Follows was when she did that role. I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit, Elsie, about the portrayals of Anne as a child in the media.
Well, I guess a lot of times it boils down to how these filmmakers are going to treat Anne's background, because there's a bunch that happens before she comes on the scene. There's all this backstory of what was her life like as an orphan, how bad was it really, and what kind of trauma might she have gone through. And so, you're dealing with book Anne, and then there's, the behind the scenes, what was Montgomery like, hinting at or not hinting at. I think that, personally, I think that the anime version of Anne of Green Gables probably handles it the best, because it tries to be faithful to Montgomery's book, but then it also borrows some of the perspective we get from adult Anne in later books to inform how they're going to tell that prequel story. So they have some flashbacks in this anime series about what her life was like before she came to Green Gables. And, they're a bit darker but they're still in keeping with how adult Anne in later books talks about her experiences. Whereas in the Netflix adaptation called Anne with an E, they choose to do a lot more backstory about before she came to Green Gables, and they get pretty dark, and they create some scenarios that aren't in the books. So that's kind of one extreme. And then, of course, the 30s or 40s, the Dawn O'Day one, that doesn't have any backstory at all. So they just completely don't deal with it. And I think that the Kevin Sullivan, does a little bit. I think that the anime version probably does it the best as far as kind of taking a middle of the road approach to kind of fill out Anne's character a bit without elaborating too much, without adding too much to what might have happened before she came.
So let me talk a little bit about the fictive world that Anne Shirley lives in, because Prince Edward Island, in some sense, is a character in at least in the first 3 or 4 books that I've read. And I think there was, maybe 10 or 11 in the original series. It was sort of like the Oz books in that sense. There was 11 or 12 originals. What we talk now a lot in this day and age of fictive universes, whether it's Marvel superheroes or Godzilla, or everything's a fictional universe. So what role does Prince Edward Island play in the Anne Shirley verse, if you will? Monica, maybe if you want to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about people who have either emigrated to Canada or born Canadians who have said that the character Anne finding a home on the island is like themselves finding a home in Canada. So it's the idea of the displaced person finding a haven of safety, an island of safety. Not a perfect world, but so much better than what they came from. So it seems to me that the island functions as a metaphor for potential home, where the character changes the homeland, but the homeland also changes in. And no matter how narrow, straight-laced, difficult, and hypocritical and whatnot the people may be, nonetheless, Anne and vicariously the newcomers who find Anne as being a metaphor for their own homeland in Canada, it's like becoming a part of a family, a community. You have an identity, you are accepted, even if you have red hair, and it's good.
Holly, if you want to pick up.
So a couple of things. I think that the novel's so deeply rooted in Prince Edward Island, so deeply rooted. And Anne herself is deeply rooted there. The minute she's there, she puts down those roots in a particular view of nature. She renames everything according to her own fictive world, if you will. I've noticed that suddenly everything is in blooms, like the landscape was kind of waiting for her. And by the end of the first novel, she is called Anne of Avonlea when she goes to recite. And so there's this transformation from being of Green Gables to Anne of Avonlea. She really is rooted in a place and is going to make that place larger and larger and larger, which is both home and also a kind of interesting imperialism at the same time. It goes both ways. She also her red hair matches the earth, as if there's this kind of symmetry involved in that. And that carriage ride. What's interesting is the early novels were not marketed per se with a child on the cover. They had more of a woman, a sort of young woman on the cover with turned up hair. So it's that redheaded kind of scraggly homeless child with the carpet bag that became the iconic Anne, but it wasn't always the case. So we sort of have transformed that meaning to that looking for home, but there's a way in which it's because Anne herself, that's her theme, is having a relationship with trees that don't move, right? Like most kids might have a relationship with farm animals, but she's all about trees and flowers and things that are rooted sort of in the earth. So I think she roots herself.
Yeah, it's funny because when I interviewed Elsie a couple of months ago, we were talking about some of the outrageous book covers that have been put on modern anthems. There's one where she's, sort of has these bedroom eyes, and she's looking out like she's some kind of, lusty.
The actress.
Yeah. So, Elsie, if I can just ask you a little bit about Prince Edward Island first, if you want to talk about as it's portrayed in the books, but also in the various media outlets or the media, yeah, the different films that you've watched. I would assume that as we gotten closer to 2020, that the later films probably did feature more of the place rather than, like you said, the Dawn O'Day original Hollywood movie.
Yeah, up on the fact that filmmakers picked up on the fact that the island is a huge draw for readers. It's a huge part of Montgomery's series and of all of her pretty much all of her other books. So they've tried to make sure that they are featuring the landscape as a character. Doesn't mean they're always filming it on Prince Edward Island, because I think there's different obstacles to filming as much of the films on location as they would like. But definitely, I think filmmakers in recent years have been very respectful of the fact that that Prince Edward Island as a play is, a character in its own right. Kind of the way that Dickens, deals with the Thames is like a character in some of his books. So, yeah, modern filmmakers have definitely picked up on that. And a lot of times, I think in the books, you see the other characters besides Anne who are more connected with the land and with nature and with the changing of seasons. Those are the kindred spirits that Anne finds. So, it's definitely, she's the one giving things their, pretty names. But there's other characters who interact with the landscape in their own very meaningful ways, and those are the people that Anne typically tends to connect with more. And then for some people, it's just, not even on their radar, like Josie Pye. I don't know if she really cares about Prince Edward Island other than the fact that maybe she wants to, get away from it at some point.
Yeah, I erroneously said there were 10 or 11. Apparently, there were 9 Anne Shirley books, 8 of which were published, I guess, in Montgomery's lifetime, and 1 which was sent but not published during her lifetime. Let me just talk a little bit, or let's talk a little bit about the series and how Anne and some of these kindred spirits evolve or don't evolve over the course of the books. So just for accuracy's sake, there's Anne of Green Gables, 1908, Anne of Avonlea, 1909, Anne of the Island, 1915, Anne of Windy Poplars, 1936, actually 1936. Maybe that might be an error what I'm reading. Maybe that was 1916, I don't know. Anne's House of Dreams, 1917, Anne of Ingleside, Rainbow Valley, and Rilla of Ingleside. And then the book that was unpublished, supposedly, is The Blythes Are Quoted. So maybe, Holly, if you want to start, what number one is the general arc of the books as they follow Anne Shirley through her life, and as these people, the Blythes, Marilla and Matthew eventually die. I think Matthew might die in the first or second book. Marilla. Let's talk about the chronology of that world.
Matthew dies over the threshold of Green Gables in the first book. It's like a really big catalyst for keeping Anne in the local landscape. I've read the rest of the series, but none of them for me have the power that the first one does. One element that interests me is how much Montgomery chose to delay Anne's marriage. And even after the marriage, female friendships are sort of still the focus of the novel. So that's been of tremendous interest to me. And I've reviewed a lot of manuscripts on subsequent series as well, and I find that as much as these look domestic and, the patterns of sort of domestic upheaval and then rectifying them sort of stand, there's also a lot of things in the cracks as you sort of move toward issues of war in later novels and mourning and other losses. Rilla is another sort of orphan. It's as if there's this kind of, what do you say in music? There's a theme and variation, if you will, very much a pattern in how she sort of structured things. But I really, really am attached to the first novel. That's where I am. I find that it opens up so many things, so many issues. To be honest, Marilla is one of my favorite characters. Yeah, and I don't know, Monica, maybe you have more attachment to the later books, with more to say about them. I'm very attached to the 1908.
Well, thanks, Holly. Yeah. So I think I'm attached to each one in different ways. I have, it's hard to pick a favorite. So like, which of your children is your favorite? Well, you're my favorite, and you're my favorite, and you're my favorite. That can't be. One has to be. Anyway, I can see, I think in many ways, Anne of Green Gables is indeed the one that I teach in children's literature, because that, of course, is the children's literature text. And then we're moving into Anne as an adult. In terms of, does Anne become less interesting in the later books, which some scholars take that view, or is she as engaged, active as a wife and mother of many children? And so we've got scholars on the one hand who say, well, Anne just stopped becoming interesting once she got married and had children, and she gave up writing in order to have children. She says in one of the books, I don't think it's House of Dreams, I think it's Ingleside, that I'm writing living epistles instead of novels. So the importance of family over a career. And other critics say, oh my goodness, she's just as interesting. And that Lucy Maud is actually celebrating, continues to celebrate safe haven home life, where you experience trauma, you experience suffering within your own home, within the community, and of course there's World War I and so on. My view is that Anne is just as interesting, and that what Montgomery celebrated in Anne, that kind of resilience, continues, but in a different way with the mature woman.
Monica, I've not read past, I think it was the fourth book, Windy Poplars. Do we follow Anne to her death in the series?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Do we follow Anne to her death? I've only read up to Windy Poplars. Do we follow Anne to her?
No, not to her death.
No. Elsie, first off, do you have a comment about the Anne of the book as she progresses, and also too in, I guess, the Sullivan stuff, they did the whole, what was it, on the town, and they also did, 3 miniseries, and becomes a war correspondent in the third miniseries, I believe. My wife has seen it, I haven't. I've seen only the first 2. So maybe if you can compare the progression of Anne in literature to the progression of Anne in the later media.
Well, I do love some of the later Anne books better than the first one, because I found it fascinating to see what kind of adult would grow up from a person like Anne in the first books. And to me, her maturity is very believable. The kind of woman that she grows into, it feels realistic. So you can see, like, she has all these, things about her childhood, which if people have only read the first book, they might think is just sweet, at times sentimental, maybe possibly annoying or cute, but like, what kind of person who, has that sort of a rich fantasy world in her life? Like, what kind of person does she grow into? And the woman that Montgomery creates, I think, is very believable. She feels like a real person. She really could come out of that childhood, and that child really could grow up into that type of woman. Where there's this scene in Anne's House of Dreams after she's married, where she's down on the beach by herself, she thinks, and she's just dancing. And that's the kind of woman she is. She might not, she still names things. She might not believe her fantasies as much as when she was a little girl, but she still has this sort of light and whimsicality about her. And I really wish that filmmakers would go deeper into her life and, try to figure out what, how to portray that in film, because they really haven't gone too far. So Kevin Sullivan, he did make some stories about Anne as an adult, but they don't follow the books. He kind of had I guess, a little bit of a conundrum, because when he made his series, he actually advanced the timeline a bit, and set it later than the books are set in the late 1800s, and Calvin Sullivan bumps it up to like early 1900s. So in his third movie, it's called Anne, the Continuing Story, and that's about when she's an adult and has some young children. That's taking place during World War I, but in the books, by the time we get to World War I, it's Anne's children that are going to the war, not her and Gilbert. So that story doesn't follow the books. And he has another one too that's kind of about her when she's an older adult. It's sort of a prequel sequel, and that also is more of a fan fiction. It's not. He couldn't really go back and fix what he did, because he changed the timeline to begin with in his first movie. So
let me, Holly, you look like you're ready, but say what you want to say, and then I've got a question for you.
Oh, as I say, Elsie, do we know why he chose to do that? Did he just want to track modernity?
I think he liked the way that the early 1900s period would look on film, if I'm remembering correctly. He just wanted to film that visually instead of late 1800s.
Holly, I know in the first few books, other than Anne, the biggest characters that get the most page time, if you will, are not the Blythes, Marilla, the Cuthberts, Marilla and Matthew, also Diane Barry, her bosom buddy, and obviously Gilbert. What of the secondary or tertiary characters in the actual original books draw you one or two, and why?
Oh, I worked a lot on Marilla. One day I was teaching it. I've taught it for years, but one day I was listening more carefully to the meeting between Anne and Marilla, and I had just taught Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I felt like I was having a deja vu. So I went back to Uncle Tom's Cabin and realized that the lines when Marilla's questioning Anne, where are you from? How old are you? Give me an account of yourself. That those lines are from Uncle Tom's Cabin when Aunt Ophelia encounters Topsy for the first time, and Topsy's a slave, right? She's a really stereotypical kind of minstrel-like character, but she's more than that too. But she's given to Aunt Ophelia to adopt and raise. And I suddenly realized that the slave narrative that Harriet Beecher Stowe authored was also behind Anne of Green Gables. So I started looking at Marilla really carefully as a kind of, I did this whole project on spinsters in the 19th century and realized that not only was child labor being seen or compared to slavery, right, which is interesting because Marilla doesn't want an English import. She wants a Canadian-born child. She's very clear. So she does have racism at the start of the novel. But also the social problem of the spinster and the orphan are both taken care of at the same time. And yet it's not completely hegemonic. They actually are kind of feminist pair. They prepare for careers. They believe girls should be prepared for careers. And so I sort of followed Topsy and Anne. And that was a wonderful project that it was just a coincidence. I happened to be teaching both and realized that was the case. So I spent a lot of time looking at Marilla. As a repressed woman, she has a lot of trouble showing emotion, and she's based on Aunt Ophelia in Uncle Tom's Cabin, who also is a very sort of crazy housekeeper. You get the sense of spinsters being repressed and not fulfilled as women, so they clean all the time, right? And they can't laugh and they can't show emotion, and they're freaked out when a child kisses them, and these girls come in and they're always playing and they're always disrupting the careful housekeeping. So there's this really interesting way that the spinster and the female orphan are negotiating sort of late 19th century feminism and finding a role for themselves and pairing up in interesting ways.
Monica, what are your thoughts on the one or two secondary or tertiary characters that interest you?
Well, I have thought more about Marilla and Matthew, and maybe Matthew a bit more than Marilla. But like you, Holly, I also really like Marilla. That for one thing, she has survived thus far, and then continues to change and grow. And so this whole idea of one of my favorite lines in reference to Marilla is that unholy laughter. So in response to, yes, how Anne is changing things, so unholy laughter in terms of the, repressive idea that laughter would be sinful. And actually in Tom Sawyer, we've got the same reference, unholy mirth. So that catches my attention. But in terms of Marilla, how she continues to kind of allow herself to change, to grow. So that is beautiful. And it's really interesting that Holly, that you brought our attention to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's been quite a while since I've read it, and I had great joy in reading it aloud to my own children quite some time ago. But one of the phrases that really caught my attention in that is the description of Uncle Tom as having a gentle domestic heart. And I thought, wow, and scholars that are looking closely at 19th century literature are saying, in reference to 20th century and now 21st century perceptions, that people in the 19th century were far less sexist in terms of how we characterize things than, in later times, which is a lovely irony, the idea that we are progressive, but actually it seems not. So the idea that a strong moral man would be described as having a gentle domestic heart. And to me, that with that one phrase really describes Matthew. So the qualities that we have gendered, historically over the centuries, but I think we have become more rigid. Perhaps we're loosening up again. But the idea that, gentle domestic, that would be female. Well, no, the idea of nurture, Matthew as the nurturer who, in a sense, challenges and eventually it's undone the what I want to say, sort of the capitalist utilitarian approach to the child laborer, the orphan, who is then simply, as it were, taken up as free labor. And Matthew's like, no, what good can we do for Anne? And of course, Marilla comes to see the light. But Matthew from the start has this caring, loving, nurturing approach. And so the idea of Matthew as portraying ideal manhood is, to me, was absolutely heartwarming.
Elsie, you look like you wanted to say something. Do you have any comment on Holly or Monica's points, or any of the secondary characters that you are most drawn to?
Okay, well, both. I wanted to talk about the secondary characters, but also when Holly was mentioning how when she was reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, she was having callbacks to Anne of Green Gables. That got me interested in what other works might have influenced Montgomery that people haven't explored yet. Because when I was reading Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm a couple of years ago, I felt like I was just reading Emily of New Moon all over again, and I was like, she copied on Montgomery, she plagiarized her. I looked at the beginning, and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm was written first, so it's the other way around. Montgomery's taking characters, like descriptions. She's taking minor characters. She's taking specific scenes that happened in Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm and using them in the Emily series. So that's what I was getting excited about when you were talking, Holly. Because I was like, wait, that happened to me too. I saw something of her books in another book, and it surprised me.
So Lucy Maud Montgomery was sort of the female version of Jack London, because he was accused many times, rightfully, of plagiarism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's a scrapbooker, literally. She takes of things and puts them together in new ways. And most authors do, but right now I'm doing a whole new thing about how And I think it's also based on Amy March in Little Women, who struggles the most with vanity, who hates her nose and loves her nose and hates her hair. They both have school humiliation scenes. There's just a lot going on there. I just started it, so I don't know where it's going. But she definitely, like, there's just these echoes and repetitions to parse out that'll give scholars something to do for the next 100 years.
Right.
Elsie, if you want to just continue on the secondary characters that draw you.
Yeah, so a character that I really, she's not like my favorite character, but I really found it interesting to read about Ruby Gillis. So in the beginning, the first book, she's just this sort of, she seems very shallow and superficial, and she's nice, but she's not, she doesn't seem to have to her, that Anne does. But in a later book, I don't remember if it's book 3 or 4, I'm not sure, but anyway, she ends up getting a terminal illness and kind of, looks at her life in a new light. And Montgomery uses Ruby Gillis's storyline to, I think, explore some interesting themes, looking at death and how to live your life. But I found it interesting because Ruby Gillis is a great example of how Montgomery takes these minor characters and still makes them real. So they're not just like these cardboard types where Anne's a real one and she has all these sort of puppets around her. But Montgomery really gives depth to even her minor characters and gives them their own personalities that feel very distinct. And that could be because she was so, proficient at writing short stories that she's able to take these deep dives into characters that we don't have whole books about, but they're there and they're still part of this very, rich world that helped to make Prince Edward Island and Anne's world feel more real because these characters moving around her are very real too, even if they don't get as much page time as the main characters. Yeah. It's just always amazed me that Montgomery created so many hundreds of characters, and we see some of the same types like orphans or spinsters used over and over again. But at the same time, they're very different from each other. I mean, like Anne is very different from Emily, and Matthew is very different from Cousin Jimmy. So like we're dealing with like these types across books, but it just shows me what a genius Montgomery is, that she's still able to give each of these minor characters life.
Yeah. You bring up a good point. I've interviewed many actors, about 30 actors on acting, and I often say that the mettle of a real actor is not those scenes where someone is dying or those high melodramatic scenes where you're bawling and crying and pulling your hair out, but it's those little bridge scenes after the dramas that show the mettle of an actor to really take a scene that could be a throwaway scene and make it great. And I think with writers who are writing novels or even plays, you can write a great main character. Everyone has that character that is dear to them, but it's what you do with the secondary and tertiary characters that you give them those little human moments that makes a great writer, more so than just having Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn. It's having the slave Jim or some of the gamblers that Huck encounters that makes that a great book. I want to take just a little pause from the Anne stuff, and because since it was brought up some of Montgomery's other works, it was mentioned Emily. But before I do that, I just wanted to pick up on the Uncle Tom thread. Uncle Tom, the term Uncle Tom is often used in a way different from the book, and it's one of the great misunderstandings about that character. Is there anything about the Anne character or the series of books or even the media portrayals in film that has been misunderstood that you notice? Monica, if you want to go first.
Well, in terms of the film portrayals, I have to date, and I haven't seen them all, so so Elsie, you would be able to speak to this better than I, but I haven't seen any sense really of the whole Christian framework, and I see so much of it throughout all her work, and also in the first novel, the first Anne book. So that seems to me completely missing. In terms of how Anne Yeah, and that would be big, I think. In terms of Anne being misunderstood, I'm not sure. In terms of yeah, no, I'm not quite sure that I know how to answer that right now.
How about you, Elsie? What do you think is misunderstood about either Anne the character or the series of books or the media portrayals, if anything?
I think that Anne could be misunderstood as a character instead of somebody that that Montgomery gave great amount of depth to. And I think that readers would need to go past the first Anne book to fill her out and not just see her actor. And as far as, because I mean, I feel like a lot of people come to Anne of Green Gables when they're kids and they read the book and it's lovely, but it just sort of melts into the fantasy of their childhood and they grow up and they're like, oh, you know, that's a sweet way to look at the world, but it's completely unattainable. You can't live like that in today's, culture. It's just a part of like, really a fantasy world. Whereas I think that that even modern day readers can take things from those books, even as an adult when you become more, cynical and disillusioned, and hang on to that and bring some of that wonder that Anne portrays into your everyday adult life in 2020. And so I think people are missing an opportunity if they just, lock Anne away into childhood, whether, as, looking at from a scholarly perspective or, just as a reader. If you just leave her as a, something from the children's literature canon without exploring, exploring her as an adult, then I think you're missing out. And you said, Monica, about the films not really picking up on some of the religious background, perhaps. I think that what's it called? It was the recent Canadian ones, Fire and Dew and The Good Stars, and I think the first one was called Ella Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, is like the official title, but they made 3 TV movies. They do end their movie with a line from the final line of Anne of Green Gables, which is God's in his heaven and all is right with the world. And they actually end one of the films that way with that line. I think that they're perhaps trying to, that film version was perhaps trying to incorporate more of the religious or Christian undertones from the book. But I mean, my suspicion is that most filmmakers have just wanted to set that aside because it might be more controversial, and they don't want to get into that. So
yeah, that was my suspicion as well. To not let's not go there. So for me, reading the books, it has such a very different flavor. And just very quickly, you've said it so wonderfully well, Elsie. But yeah, so I have that sense that people who are, adults who are, and English professors for that matter, who are dismissive of Montgomery as being sentimental, have either not read her or just don't. Readers of other writers have the impression that Montgomery does not treat serious themes, and she does right from the start.
Right.
Holly, go ahead.
Can I just add one thing? I think Monica's absolutely right that the Christian narrative gets lost. It's totally been lost in the Uncle Tom stereotype, right? Because the whole thing about Uncle Tom, once it was Uncle Tom's Cabin was adapted for stage, they aged him to an older character and made his body a lot more feeble. They couldn't deal with the fact that he's a Christ symbol in the novel, right? And he's very strong and very attractive and very young, and people got really uncomfortable with that being the Christ symbol and also his relationship with Eva. So by the time you get to the later 19th century, you have an older gray-haired Tom who's no threat to anybody, who seems a lot more kind of passive. So that's absolutely right. We sort of don't want to go to that narrative. But I would say the other narrative that is in the novel a little bit is the kind of the way in which Anne's body is different from all the other girls. It's a more angular body. She's not the same as the more matronly girls like Diana. She feels really, really different, and that kind of difference in 1908 wasn't necessarily seen as a kind of queerness, but about 20 years later kind of was. And so there were other novels that picked up on these kind of alien redheaded figures who didn't fit in, whose bodies were different, who weren't really interested in romance yet. The films tend to take the romance and embed it a little bit earlier and make more of it than the first novel does. And you know, the intellectual potential. She's so intellectual and so artistic. And by the 1920s, that was seen as a potential for someone becoming lesbian. And she certainly loves women. She loves Diana. She gushes about how she'll hate her husband later. I mean, so there's like this interesting potential that wasn't explored in 1908, but was kind of later as a legacy, particularly in another redheaded child in Well of Loneliness. But so like I think that's one way Anna's misunderstood. She's kind of on the threshold of a difference that could go in a variety of ways. And a lot of times they make her prettier, if that makes sense. They do the same thing with Jo March. They often make her prettier and more elegant when she really just doesn't fit in femininity and that kind of discourse, if that. So she's almost, what's the word? She's almost alien to the landscape as much as she's kind of it.
Let me just ask you, Holly, since you're the C.S. No, Monica's the C.S. Lewis expert. Let me ask Monica, regarding the Christianity, I remember back when the Harry Potter and Tolkien films were big about 15, 20 years ago, they also did a couple of the first two Narnia books as films. And from what I recall, they totally nuded any of the Christian themes there as well. So I think that's a larger narrative that most of Hollywood, I mean, I'm not religious and I don't like being preached to, but, you know, when you take out something essential from a work like that, you're missing something. Do you think that the Anne books have been sort of like nuded a bit because of that lack of the Christianity?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last
Do you
question.
think the Anne books have been sort of nuded because they took out the Christian undertones or themes?
Oh, well, I'm trying to see how I might answer that question. I do feel, so as Elsie, as you said earlier, that people maybe don't want to go there because they think it's controversial, or maybe it's simply, you know, a lack of understanding what Montgomery is doing. It seems to me it would be amazing, I think, if someone wished to, you know, who understood the Christian narrative and understood the complexity with which Montgomery is wrestling with it. You know, so evil, suffering happening in a world that God has made, that God is sustaining. How do you deal with that when your newborn dies, when your friend dies, when World War I is happening? Montgomery does all that, and it seems to me it would be a tremendous gift to the world if we could, through film, wrestle with these things as Montgomery does.
Okay, let's move on then, as I said, to some of the non-Anne works. I think it was Elsie who mentioned there's an Emily trilogy. There's a character named Pat that has a couple of books, The Story Girl, a few standalone novels, and then her short story collections. So let me start with you, Holly. Of what I've just mentioned, do any of those characters, do any of those series stand out, or is the Anne series sort of the Everest of the Himalayas? There, you know, is that the crowning work?
Well, I mean, I am not an expert on any of the others, but what I can say from reviewing manuscripts is that Emily seems to have stood the test of time. Many, many, many manuscripts on Emily come up, particularly as I guess, I don't know them that well. Elsie, maybe you can comment. They get a little more gothic, right? A little bit more dark, I guess, but still they retain sort of the way imagination can sort of build coping and a feeling of home. But I get a lot of submissions on the Emily series.
Elsie, if you want to pick up on that.
Well, yeah, so Anne Shirley is like the sun, and Emily Starr is the moon. She's twilight, and Anne is dawn. And Emily has to work harder for everything. And you take all of Anne's circumstances and you color them a shade darker, and you get Emily. So, like, she has a harder time making friends, and she has a harder time winning love with the people that she's living with, because she's also an orphan. But it takes her longer, and she has to work harder. And she has a harder time at school. Like, everything that you think Anne had struggles to overcome, Emily has those as well, except in much more difficult circumstances. And Emily is much more of an introvert, and Anne is, much more bubbly. So I think that the Emily series, fans really like them, so they're nuanced, and they certainly aren't as well known as Anne, but I think they stand the test of time just as well. And then you've got some other very interesting characters in some of her other books as well. There's, Pat is one of her only heroines who actually has, an intact, like, nuclear family with a father and mother.
Is that the Story Girl? Is Pat from the Story Girl?
No, that's Pat Gardner, Pat of Silverbush, and Mistress Pat. It's a 2-book set.
Okay.
But in a way, Pat's kind of an orphan too, because her parents are very much in the background, even of her books. But Pat is very domestic, except she, wants to be mistress of her own house, and she doesn't really have any thoughts of marriage, but she loves home and everything it involves. She loves hospitality and, like, building this haven for her family, and she loves her home very, very deeply. I'd say more than Anne is attached to Green Gables, even more than Emily's attached to New Moon Farm. Pat is the most home-centric character. She's married to her home, to her house. So she's an interesting character. And then you have the Story Girl. That's sort of, those books are a lot like Rainbow Valley and the later Anne books that feature Anne's children. They're sort of about, like, the set of friends, cousins, and a couple of friends in the next two. And they're told from a boy's perspective, which is different. The Story Girl is not, she's not the perspective we're getting these books from. It's from this boy who comes with his brother to live with cousins on Prince Edward Island. And the Story Girl is this character that they become friends with. And then, of course, you've got Jane of Lantern Hill. She spends part of her time in, is it Vancouver? Or, I'm not sure, but she's not from Prince Edward Island.
It is Vancouver, I think.
Okay. She spends half her time there, and then half her time on the island. Her parents are separated or divorced, and so she's sort of, an orphan as well. And that book is perhaps, it might deal with like the religious questions, maybe even, I'm trying to think of examples that would deal with it more, but perhaps that book most of all, because Jane has a lot of questions about God and the Bible, and she has these conversations with her father on the island about, she comes from her home with her grandmother, and her mother is not full of much love. It's very, very repressed. And so she has these distorted views of God and the Bible. And then when she comes to Prince Edward Island, her father's kind of showing her all this beauty that's in the Bible. And, as she's seeing the beauty of the island and coming alive in that way, it's as if she gets a second chance at having, a morality and religion that's not this narrow, repressed, harsh version that she gets back with her grandmother. And then, of course, there's the Blue Castle and A Tangled Web, which are her books for adults. I think Monica said she was going to talk more about those. That's all the ones with children heroines, right? So,
Monica,
yeah.
I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
Well, that was the Blue Castle?
Yeah.
Yeah. So The Blue Castle is definitely one of my favorites. And I was fascinated to learn that in Poland, back in the days of the Solidarity movement, the Polish people would put on this musical based on the Blue Castle, and they could do it because the Soviets didn't realize that the Polish people perceived this, what looked like just a silly romance, quote unquote silly romance, was actually giving the Polish people courage to be subversive um, in response to the regime. And so the book is, it's just amazing how Montgomery deals with the 29-year-old spinster who's totally repressed in this culture, and how she overcomes fear. So this quality of fear, as it's even named as the root of all evil in that book, and it's just amazing to me how with what humor, and Montgomery has said, if you really want to be critical, it's best to do it in a jest. Don't take it sort of, be harsh and preachy about it. And one of my favorite lines, I'm just going to read it right here. So the main character, Valency, the 29-year-old spinster, the narrator says, had long ago decided that she would rather offend God than Aunt Wellington, because God might forgive her, but Aunt Wellington never would. And so, yeah, I mean, the whole story is about this amazing pushback and how the character overcomes the societal repression, or as she's experiencing it in her community.
I wanted to talk about the short stories in a moment, but it seems to me from what both Elsie and Monica you have said, that Montgomery's works got more and more complex thematically and structurally, but none of them ever seem to reach, I guess, the popular heights of Anne. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
That's why she kept writing Anne novels. Like the Anne series are sprinkled throughout her career. So she'd write about someone else, and then she'd come back and do another Anne novel for the fans, and then write something else in another Anne novel. So she had to keep coming back to those. And I forgot to mention Magic for Marigold, but that was another for standalone child heroines.
And also, it looks like she did write short stories collections featuring Anne, but also non-Anne short stories. So I don't know, Elsie, if you want to just speak a little bit about the Anne versus non-Anne short works.
I haven't read many of her short stories, so I don't think I'm good to speak for that.
How about you, Monica?
I think I've read, I've read Chronicles of Avonlea, further chronicles, and more are being discovered. And I just delight in them. I think she also deals with serious themes and does so very compassionately. One of my favorites, I'll just say, and that I teach regularly, is called Each in His Own Tongue. And in that, she is looking at the outsider character, old Abel Blair, who is like the town drunk. And yet he has these, marvelous insights that by which he is challenging the sort of religious orthodoxy of the community. And in the end, he's right, and everyone knows it. It's a beautiful story about the Scottish Presbyterian Calvinist culture as they interpreted Calvin. And so this whole idea that, laughter would be sinful, certain kinds of music, like the violin, that would be sinful. And so this whole idea that each person really needs to use the gifts that they have particularly been given, and each person matters, each person in his unique voice has that capacity to really to give the message of the gospel. And it is totally a matter of life and death in this story. So it's fascinating to me how she celebrates, in this case, music, imaginative, really emotional understanding. So rational, didactic, academic explanation of truth has its place, but it only does so much. And for some people, it doesn't really work very well. So the idea that all gifts need to work together.
Holly, you said you had a comment on the short story, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I would just say that that scholars are starting to get more interested in integrating the short stories, particularly in terms of her narrative technique. So, for example, there's a new collection. It's not out yet. It's called Montgomery and Gender by Laura Robinson and E. Holly Pike. And there are a lot of essays in there that do address gender in the short stories. She did what most writers did, which was use the short stories to practice different kinds of techniques. So you have things about twins, male, female twins, and a lot of her techniques that she practiced are comic. Actually, they do stand out. And we were talking about that earlier. And you were saying, tertiary characters are important in acting. But the thing about her novels is she does maintain a very comic lens. Not quite Mark Twain, but there's a lot of irony, a lot of comic rendering of things and characters. So there, interest is growing in them. And I would suggest looking at the newer collections that integrate the way she playfully sort of used those stories as apprentice works.
Okay, now I want to talk about Elsie's sort of expertise in the filmic adaptations. On her website, tianingsociety.com, she has a lengthy series of reviews and comments about the sort of film. But before I ask about the Anne films, has there ever been any adaptations in film on non-Anne works that we just mentioned? I don't know, Elsie, do you know?
Not much. So there is a little bit done of Emily. There's an anime series, and then there's also a live action that was filmed on Prince Edward Island and ran for maybe about 4 seasons. And then there's Kevin Sullivan also did a Jane of Lantern Hill miniseries.
Okay.
And I think that's all.
All right. Well, let me.
There's been stage adaptations, but.
Okay, so let's start with you, Elsie, and we'll go through it chronologically from beginning to the latest, the Anna with an E series. Talk about them, and then Holly and Monica, if you have any comments once Elsie has set this table, feel free to jump in. So from what I'm looking on your website, then I'll trust you over Wikipedia. The first film that was ever adapted must have been a silent in 1919. Do you have any comments about that, Elsie?
Well, it's lost, unfortunately. They still have some stills from it, and there's a project to kind of restore that, restore what stills that have been saved with scripts that they have as well, and kind of make a mashed together film. But I do know that Montgomery saw it and she didn't like it. So, but I mean, it would be interesting to have just for historical purposes, but to have them restore what shots they have from the film. But Montgomery wasn't a fan of that one.
How about the 34 film? That's the one that starred Dawn O'Day, and then she took the name of Anne Shirley as her stage name.
Yeah, so that one was a big success. I think it was a box office hit, and Montgomery said it was pretty good. She said that they gave it a silly, sentimental ending, which they did, but I guess that's kind of what they did with movies back then. Its main shortcoming is it's just really short. It kind of has to compress the narrative a lot, and they sort of, do a few scenes to let you get to know these characters, and then all of a sudden, after this kind of long intro period, then they do this really quickly pressed together romance between Anne and Gilbert, and then bam, it's over. So it's kind of, but the actors are good, and Dawn O'Day does a great job. And I think Matthew does a great job. And there's some other things. It's so old, it's hard to know, I mean, Diana has blonde hair, and I mean, they make some funny changes, which maybe back in that day of filmmaking, they needed a blonde type or something, and that was just, something they did with film. So I don't know. There's, probably some background. Why they made certain changes. Marilla is this very, she's very much a grumpy character. So maybe that had more to do with that culture at the time, of what they're expecting to get from movies. So.
And they did a sequel.
I don't understand.
And they did a Dawn O'Day sequel, right, with Windy Poplars?
Yeah, then they did Windy Poplars. which is good. Unfortunately, it lost money in the box office. It was not the success that their earlier film was, so I think that was kind of a surprise. And it's a good movie. It's fun. They do use some characters from the book, and they tighten up the plot. They don't make it quite so episodic as the book is. But I suppose there's nothing really to write home about, but it is fun. And it uses some of the same actors. Dawn O'Day's in it again.
Oh.
They switch out the Gilbert, so you got to watch closely for that. But it's fun.
Monica, I know, Holly, you said you haven't seen any of the other media. Monica, did you ever see the original Hollywood films with Dawn O'Day?
No, I have not.
No.
I saw the 1985 and I loved it.
Yeah.
I believe they used the Lady of Shalott to
Yeah,
bring her in to this. I loved some of their changes, and I saw the first season of Anne with an E, and I loved it. I just didn't ever get back to it, but I thought their Anne was spot on. Awkward, gangly, younger, not feminine really, but very lively. I thought she was really good. And then they seem to have tackled many contemporary issues. It reminded me of what they did with Little House on the Prairie when I was young, by using it as a ruse to talk about more contemporary issues. So do they keep that up? Is that what they do?
Yeah, I haven't seen all the seasons of Anne with an E, but yeah, they definitely. And I think maybe they have 4 seasons, or they're gonna do a 4th one as their final one. They definitely, the further on you get, the more they diverge from the books and kind of bring in new characters and new, scenes that didn't happen in the books.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the reason I wanted to do this show is I saw one day on Twitter, it said Anne 1 million, and I've seen so many stupid comic book things where, like, Superman 1 million, and I said, oh God, don't tell me they made Anne a superhero or something. So I clicked on the link, and apparently there were 1 million protests over the canceling of the 3rd season. So I don't know if they're going to have a 4th season. But anyway, that was the genesis for doing this show, was just seeing that odd little thing. And speaking of which, television, you list 1952 that there was a TV show made of Anne of Green Gables. Was that Canadian, Elsie, or was that American?
Is that the Joan Craft one? Yeah, that was made by the BBC. So not American.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what.
Well, the Joan Craft one was 72, it says. You listed 1952 Anne of Green Gables, a TV series by Pamela Brown, no recordings remain.
Right. Yeah, that's another lost one.
Okay.
And I don't remember if it was Canadian film or not.
Okay. And then it looks like the BBC did their own Anne of Avonlea, a BBC miniseries directed by Joan Craft. But you did review that one, so what was that like?
Oh, that one's good.
Yeah.
They did Anne of Green Gables too, which is another lost one. We seem to have a lot of lost Anne films.
Was that sort of like Upstairs, Downstairs meets Anne of Green Gables?
Not quite. It's pretty. I felt like it was pretty accurate to the books. And Joan Craft, like I said, the first one she made was lost, but she did a movie of Anne of Avonlea that takes scenes from Anne of Avonlea and Anne of the Island. So it's really fun because other filmmakers have not really ventured into that territory much of those 2 books. And it was fun to have this sort of long, it's hours-long miniseries that's dealing with these beloved scenes that you don't get in any of the other film versions. So it's quite fun.
And in 79 comes the anime version. And for some reason, the Japanese adore Anne Shirley. What is the genesis of that, do you think, Elsie?
So I'm trying to remember all the background. I know that I guess the Anne books were brought to Japan after World War II by a teacher. Maybe someone else can speak to. I mean, I'm not sure. I've read the backstory on that before, but I don't think I'm going to remember the details well.
Holly, you were shaking your head, Holly. Do you know why Anne is so big in Japan?
Well, I mean, no one can pretend to know exactly why. It's one of those things. A lot of children's literature from the West were brought in after World War II. One particularly popular work after World War II in Japan was The Long Winter, which is part of the Little House series. And I think it's a little obvious why that particular book, it's all about them being stuck inside for, snow blizzard after blizzard after blizzard, and it kind of, threats to their livelihood, and trying to recover and trying to make a life out of impossible conditions. So it makes sense that something like that would work. But Anne is incredibly popular in Japan. The title is Anne of Red Hair, actually. So it seems a lot more about her identity and difference than about the landscape per se. But probably the same things everybody else likes about it. The worship of nature, the idea of home, all of these things, the value of education, all these things probably are poignant. But I also know that Japanese tourism in Prince Edward Island is a really big phenomena. In fact, there are apparently couples who go to reify their vows in, Prince Edward Island. So it's a very large phenomena.
And then we, of course, get to the Kevin Sullivan film, 1980s, the two miniseries and the later one. And, of course, as I was 20, 21 when they came out. And, of course, I saw that. And I adored, what's her name, the character who played Anne, Megan Follows. And to me, that seemed to be the most lush. It seemed so much richer than the Hollywood version of the early one, but yet that, I think, the first two, then Anne and Anne of Avonlea, combined, I think, the first 4 books, because there was stuff from Windy Poplars in the second one. So Elsie, what those first 2 that I'm familiar with, they were based on the books. The third one wasn't, right?
Right. Correct. Yeah, they're pretty based on the books. The second one he made definitely compresses some characters for the sake of time. It sort of, takes a few characters and mashes them into, 1 or 2 characters, so you don't have quite as big of a cast as the book has. But I think I don't think Kevin Sullivan was was some kind of a lifelong Anne fan. I think he just read the book and said, I think this is going to make a good movie. But he took a lot of care with it, and he had actors that really loved the books. I think Colleen Dewhurst was one of them who took her, role as Marilla very, very carefully and seriously. And I don't know, there's just a lot of things that seem to align right in those series, with a good score and, good costumes and great actors. And I'm sure people like me, we love it for, the nostalgia factor, because I did grow up watching it, but I try to watch it as an adult as critically as I can, and just be, really critical and ignore all the nostalgia factor, and I still think it's a good film. So I can see some more of its shortcomings now than I could when I was younger, but to me it holds up. It's great. It's not my favorite anymore, but it's excellent. So.
Well, the first decade of this century saw a lot of, there was the TV show Avonlea, and then you list in your article, there were a lot of films not based on the original novels. There was the animated series, Journey to Green Gables, A New Beginning, and then another anime film there as well. How faithful, let me just talk, I guess, basically about the TV series, because that one I do remember. I think even Gilbert Blythe not Gilbert Blythe, the actor who played him, who died a few years ago, came on for a couple of guest episodes. What was the Avonlea series? Was that based on some of those short stories that we'd mentioned about Anne, or was that just totally taken off in its own direction?
I believe that those were also made by Kevin Sullivan, that TV series you're talking about. I think those are based on some of the Avonlea short stories, and also on the Story Girl, from the Story Girl and the Golden Road, which are 2 of Montgomery's other novels. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been a long time since I've watched those TV shows, but I think Sarah Stanley is a character in that Road to Avonlea series, and she is the Story Girl from Montgomery's book.
And you had mentioned, Elsie, that there was L.M. Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, which was a TV movie by John Kent Harrison. Were these all Canadian productions then? The later ones, they were?
Yeah. So there's it gets a little murky, because after Kevin Sullivan did, that Anne of Green Gables TV miniseries in the 80s. It was so popular, he sort of built an empire around it and ended up, doing the TV show, doing the later Anne miniseries, doing some animated Anne stuff. So there's a whole bunch of Kevin Sullivan related stuff. Some of it follows the books, and some of it's sort of just fan fiction. And then the one you were mentioning, the Canadian one, that's a new one that came out at the same time as Anne with an E was coming out, and that's 3 TV movies. But it's not Kevin Sullivan at all. In fact, those ones, Ellen Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, The Good Stars and Fire and Dew, those I think are endorsed by Ellen Montgomery's granddaughter, Kate McDonald Butler, who has had some differences with Kevin Sullivan over the years. So they're definitely completely separate from what Kevin Sullivan was doing with his stories and spinoffs.
It seems that just as that Anne became a media franchise, and the other big media franchise that Americans might know from Canada was the Degrassi series, the Degrassi Street, Degrassi Junior High, Degrassi High, and then it became like Degrassi The Next Generation or something, which followed modern teenagers through their trials and tribulations. What has there ever been sort of an Anne fatigue in Canada, in the media sense?
Monica has it. Yeah. I'm not sure.
You're asking about Anne with an E that came out?
Well,
yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what exactly are you asking me?
Well, basically, I had said how there seemed to be, in this century at least, just looking at the list that Elsie had, there seems to be so many Anne productions. Has there been sort of an Anne weariness to it, because it seems to have become a cottage industry?
I see no sign of weariness. I do think that the Megan Fallows, that those movies are kind of generally really the favorite. I do know that, generally speaking, listening to people and so on, that the Anne with an E books, the audiences of the films are really quite divided. Some are saying, yay, this is wonderful, and oh, look it, we're through these films we're addressing issues that are in the subtext of the stories, but now we're freer to address those. And others are saying, oh no, this is totally unfaithful. This is not at all Montgomery's vision. So I'd say with that, there's really divided opinion.
Let me just, a couple of questions for Elsie, and then I want to sort of bring this, wrap the whole thing up a bit. You mentioned Anne with an E, and Monica was just talking about the division between fans about that. From what I've read online, it seems that it's not only more modern in dealing with subtext, but it seems to have gone to a trope that I know Hollywood seems to think that a word can't be deep unless it's dark. And the original Anne wasn't dark in the sense that, she was an angsty, pulling her hairs out, looking in the mirror and cutting herself kind of thing. And it seems that a lot of people online are like, well, this isn't the Anne that we knew from the books. This isn't the Anne that we grew up with. What is your take, Elsie, about the Anne with an E, the character?
Yeah, I think it is very controversial because I don't think that the makers of Anne with an E were not afraid of shock value at all, wanting to explore these certain issues. I think they were willing to, surprise and shock fans a little bit if it meant that they could get us to pry deeper into the novel. So, whether or not you see that and then you look at the novel and say, oh yeah, that's there. Or if you look at the novel and say, no, that's still a different story. I think that's just going to be really subjective. Like if you look at the blog post I wrote where I talked about my opinions of all of the Anne films, and you look at the comment section, which is pretty long, you have people on both sides of the fence saying like, oh, this is amazing. I'm a lifelong Anne fan of the books, and I really loved Anne with an E. And then you have other people they're also lifelong fans of the books, and they love it. So it's not just people that have, are coming to Anne for the first time through the movie. It's people who did grow up reading the books and are still finding Anne with an E something very meaningful and refreshing and needed. So I don't know.
So I want to just, before I pull back out and we wrap it up and I bring Holly and Monica in to end things, let me just ask you, Elsie, since you obviously have the most experience in watching the adaptations. You had mentioned that the Sullivan original duo and then trilogy of films were no longer your favorite. So let me ask you, what do you think was the best filmic adaptation, and which of the actresses do you think gave the best portrayal of Anne? Elsie.
So my favorite is the anime one from 1979 because it's long and they're able to just really immerse you in the whole book and not just cherry pick different episodes that they think would film well because they can paint and draw everything. They don't have to be constrained by the human actors that these live action films have. So it's just very, and again, it's taking that love that a lot of Japanese people have for the Anne books and portraying that on film. So it's just very lovingly done. It's not trying to be groundbreaking or push the envelope or anything or explore. It's just very trying to just adapt the book as faithfully and lovingly as possible. And so it's just beautiful. And there's a lot of attention to detail that I love, that you could just, rewatch it and notice new things every time.
Was that the best Anne
my
too?
favorite.
Was that the best Anne too, the cartoon or the anime version?
They do age her very nicely, where she is this awkward, annoying character when she first comes on the scene, and then she becomes, thoughtful and mature and has this, depth to her, humility. She's still just like smart and fiery, but she's also wise by the end of the series, and that's very beautiful to watch how they do that with the anime series. I think perhaps I really do like Megan Follins's portrayal. She was a bit, older when she was cast and had to act like a younger character, in the first movie. But I think she captures well this sort of inner fantasy life that Anne brings, but without being too cutesy and without being I don't know. She doesn't have. I guess it's the way she responds to her earlier, traumas and stuff. She doesn't seem as wounded as the character the actress who plays Anne in the Anne with an E series, Amy Beth McNulty, I think is her name, who just, I don't know, completely. It's just a very different reading of the book in both of those films, and a look of like how Anne is, responding to her background before she comes to Green Gables.
Yeah, I've only seen Dawn O'Day, Megan Follows, and then I think it was the adaptation with Martin Sheen as Matthew. And the girl, I forget the girl's name. The girl in the Martin Sheen version seemed too young, and she didn't seem. She didn't seem to grasp some of the stuff. The Dawn O'Day was more or less to me a typical 1930s, 40s heroine, whereas Megan Follows hit that sweet spot in between there. So that's just my opinion. But so let me just then backtrack here and ask Holly and Monica, because I want to wrap it up and give you some closing thoughts. But I did want to bring up one fictive character that I have thought Anne had some congress with, and when I saw some of the Anne with an E, they have the Netflix season 1 trailer, season 2 trailer, and I saw a few little 4 or 5 minute snippets, and that's Francine Nolan, the character from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which I think is every bit the equal as a great book as Huck Finn or Moby Dick. And I think she's a great character and a great narrator. And it seemed to me that the Anne with the E, when I saw some of the clips, it reminded me more of that darkness that's inherent in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. So let me just start with you, Holly, and Monica, and then I'll hit to Elsie. What other female characters do you think from works are sort of kindred spirits, if you will, with Anne Shirley? And do you agree with my stating someone like Francie Nolan from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is a character that has some kinship? Holly, if you want to go.
Absolutely. But, you could list them, right? Laura Ingalls, Caddy Woodlawn, all of these wild girls. One of the questions we have in queer studies when we look at older characters before that was kind of a lens is like almost every popular character is a tomboy, an active tomboy who I have a colleague who like objects to the word tomboy, so let me put it in quotations, but a sort of non-feminine, agentic, spirited girl who over the course of the novel must be tamed into womanhood. That's so we could line them up. Right, the ones naturally suited for social life aren't that interesting in literature and don't really usually mirror the authors themselves and how they felt about growing up in social norms, right? But Francie Nolan is a perfect example, right? She's really spirited. She uses the social world for her own benefit. She learns very nitty-gritty world lessons. Some of the episodes that I saw with Anne with an E, I thought were amazing. I mean, I'm not a person who needs fidelity to a text.
Yeah.
I assume any text has gaps and fissures in it. And to explore those and see what's going on in the seams is, to me, media should do that. So one episode that I saw was Anne got her period and freaked out, and Marilla had to. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's the kind of thing readers of Anne of Green Gables want to know. When did it happen? How did it happen? Those are the things we want to know now, and I don't see any reason not to take the character. To me, that's the lasting life of a character. If it can be imported into various kinds of contemporary scenarios, then they've proven their value to me.
How about you, Monica? What is your comment, if any, on Francie Nolan and any other characters?
So an author that comes to mind who's just really great at always portraying the outsider, gangly, misfit, etc., be that male or female, is Catherine Patterson. And I was thinking in particular of Sarah Louise in Jacob Have I Loved. And she doesn't kind of figure out how to make things work for her. It's like she messes up everything, so to speak, in terms of how she's perceived. But yeah, Catherine Patterson is one that is really, I think, so very compassionate about all of us really as the darker sides, the embarrassing moments, and of course, writing in another time period, Catherine Patterson is totally capable and does in that book, in reference to when did she get her period? Yeah, we totally know this. Whereas in Anne of Green Gables, we have gentle fluctuations, something like that. So it really does pose the question which is always a silly question to ask, but nonetheless we tend to ask it, how would an author from an earlier time be writing this today? What things would be the same? So there's lots to think about, and I agree with you too, Holly, that film really gives an opportunity to dig into the gaps, but then again, has the digging been faithful to the narrative as you have perceived it? So we're always asking those questions, and those are excellent questions to ask.
Yeah, I think obviously, if someone tried to adapt and make, Anne Shirley a serial killer, that would not work. But Elsie, what is your thoughts on any other literary characters that we haven't mentioned, like Francie Nolan or anyone else that you think might have some relation to Anne Shirley?
I do think it's interesting what you said about the Anne with an E series seeming to be a little bit more similar in tone to Francie Nolan series. I see that too now that you mentioned that. But yeah, you do have a lot of characters who seem that they need to be tamed in some way as they leave childhood behind. And you have like Jo March, of course, and then there's Katie Carr from the What Katie Did series by Susan Coolidge. And then there's one I really like called Bride Island by Mabel Robinson. It's a little bit less known, and Caddy Woodlawn, like Holly mentioned. So, and Laura, Ingalls in some ways. These characters that are very wild and free spirits, and then they have to face, society and have to face, what the expectations are of the age they're living in, and then find a way to stay true to themselves, even while they're, stepping into these roles that they need to fill, as, usually as often as wives and mothers, but, that's not the only thing. But I think, it might just be a concern of our modern times that we, want to look at these characters as perhaps shortchanging themselves, when I'm not sure that's, that's always the case. The characters are really always, bending the knee to what society expects of them. I think they find ways to be true to themselves and to take on these roles, which are good, and still be, still be true to themselves. And there's this one line from Patty Woodland I was trying to remember but I can't. But it's where her father is telling her, like, it's okay to be more feminine, and you're not going to be doing anything less heroic, and taking on like this new role. So I don't know, like in our modern times, children of today, we do like have to, grow up at some point into, what our society expects of us. So it looks different today than it did back then, but, people still face that. Kids today still face that growing up process. And sometimes it's not always, what you think, how you think your life is going to turn out. And you don't always get to choose. Sometimes things just happen to you, and, it's how are you going to step into that with grace and embrace, what you can bring to those roles that you have in your life. And I don't know, I think it's a choice that those characters in the books come to that, is still relevant today, because our choices might look different. We might not all have to step into, a domestic role as some of these girls do, but in some ways we do have to conform. So,
well, before I solicit a final comment on anything I may have missed for all of you, I just want to say I will link to both Monica's and Holly's websites, as well as the Tea and Ink Society, specifically the page regarding all of Elsie's reviews. So let me just ask Monica, do you have any final comments, anything I may have missed or we haven't brought up that you just want to say before we go?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say, maybe even in reference to Japan, the absolute delight that so many have coming to Prince Edward Island as well. I was just thinking, why is that? But it applies to really all of us. And so I'm just thinking that Montgomery really, she's totally hooked on the orphan metaphor and this idea that we're all orphans and terrible things happen and we will suffer, the human story. And she speaks into that with hope and the idea that home and community can be found. You find yourself totally alone, but that's not the end. So this idea of overcoming darkness. And I really liked, Elsie, how you said stepping into what comes with grace. I think that's wonderfully said. I think Montgomery really does that all the time.
Elsie, any final comments you want to make?
Just the fact that I hope that people who love, the first Anne of Green Gables book will keep reading the rest of the series and read other things that Montgomery has written, because she's just a delightful author, and she has this sharp satire and wit, and she has this insight to human nature, and these beautiful descriptions that I'd be hard pressed to find, anywhere else. She just the love she has for nature and for the land. There's just a whole lot of good treasure to be found in the rest of Montgomery's books.
Holly, any comments?
Oh, just that I would say I think that there's a huge scholarly movement to complexify Montgomery and actually kind of face those perceptions from academe earlier that thought her sentimental or lesser or whatever, popular and not worthy of study. There's this huge impulse. There's exhibits on Montgomery. There's multiple collections coming out. There's the Prince Edward Island Institute. There's a new Montgomery journal. So I think all of those are sort of pushing us to reconsider her value as a literary figure and not just a popular kind of figure. So just to check out those things, I would say people should look.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for talking about Lucy Maud Montgomery and Anne of Green Gables. It was a really good conversation, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.